So we've talked a little bit about how institutions, including international institutions, can affect negotiations. It's worth spending a little bit more time talking about that, specifically how the design and setup of negotiations can impact how they play out and whether or not they're successful. So I think it's worth pointing out that context matters. The environment in which negotiations take place affects whether they succeed or whether they fail. And while it's a little bit hard with negotiation research to really draw any sort of iron uh, laws about what makes things successful. Each situation is a process. Each situation is different and can be have its own challenges. There are a variety of different themes or elements that keep coming up time and time again in negotiations that's maybe worth paying attention to. So one of those things is, where do negotiations take place? Do you have negotiations occur in a neutral location? Do you put it in a city where there's a lot going on and people are going to be out and moving around? Do you put it in a very rural place where people are essentially like locked in and there's nowhere else to go? Do you put it in a biased location, right? Are you meeting and you have a mediator and the mediator clearly favors one side? Are you meeting in that mediator's home country or home territory? Those kind of things can shape how people at the table perceive their situation and interact with each other. Similarly, you might want to pay attention to the layout of the room, right? Are there two cookie coffee stations when you exit from the negotiation room? In which case, people on one side go to that cookie coffee station and people to the other, go to the other cookie coffee station and they grumble amongst themselves about what the other side is doing and they don't interact. Whereas if you have a single cookie and coffee station, right, everybody goes and they get their coffee and they have to make nice and ask, would you please pass the cream or sugar packets or whatever. And those kind of interactions can create spontaneous space for more human interactions. And if we're thinking about negotiations as a process where I have to feel good about interacting with my counterpart rather than just I got a good deal, that kind of thing can matter a lot. Another thing that oftentimes comes up is the shape of the table, right? A round table suggests that everybody's equal. A square table works well, except if you have three parties, then somebody's going to be in the middle at sort of the head of the table. That maybe doesn't work so well. Do you want a rectangle? Well, then you really have either somebody at the head of the table, or maybe you create an adversarial dynamic. We're on one side, you're on the other. I think the negotiations about the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, I believe, involved the creation of a triangle table for the various different sides so that each could be represented as equal parties. It's, again, maybe a silly thing, but those sort of environmental factors shape how people are going to interact, shape some of the assumptions that they bring with them and maybe are acting on subconsciously. Negotiations may be affected by who's paying for negotiations to play out. So particularly with civil wars where you have rebel groups that maybe don't have deep pockets to finance, protracted multi-year negotiations in four-star hotels, having somebody who's willing to foot the bill to make sure that those negotiations can play out, to make sure the parties continue talking and engaging and can afford to participate in that process might be important. It can also be something that works to build trust, right? If you're, investing to make sure that your adversary is able to have a full delegation and participate fully, that can be a source of signaling a real commitment to making those negotiations work. You might want to think about the kind of interactions that are going to take place. Are there going to be lots of opportunities for spontaneous interaction? Who's going to be meeting directly? Is it going to be heads of state? Is it going to be low-level people? How frequently are those interactions going to take place? How frequently is there going to be communication back to your home countries? All of that can matter and can shape some of the incentives that people bring with them. And then the level of media coverage, right? Are you going to have your negotiations take place behind closed doors? Are you going to be regularly going out and interacting with the media? Are you going to be leaking information to the media? There have been studies that have shown that negotiators will use the media strategically to undercut things that they don't like, maybe to soften up the public for things that might seem like a surprise that they're worried will be not received well. So there's a lot of different things that might play into this, and there's no, right way or wrong way. Each situation ends up being unique. Another aspect of how international organizations can affect negotiations is this idea of soft power and agenda setting, right? And I think we oftentimes underestimate how much power agenda setting really has, particularly in large negotiations. If you're able to define what is the problem, what are we going to be working on, what's the order that we work on this problem in, and what are the topics and the subtopics that we're going to be focusing on, that really has a lot of power to shape what those conversations look like, to shape what gets debated and discussed, and to shape what doesn't get debated and what doesn't get discussed. And if you have that power to set the agenda, you can make sure that the things that you care about end up getting talked about and debated and discussed, and maybe talked about in a way that starts from your starting point of what you would like to see. And if you have the power to control the agenda, you can make sure that the things you don't want discussed just never really become part of the negotiation. You can block things that might otherwise be harmful. And so that's a very powerful factor, who gets to write up that agenda and run the meetings. We might also look at committees. Committees are very commonly used in large, complex negotiations, right? Congress runs with a committee system to draft legislation. The World Trade Organization has committee structures to navigate, industrial policy versus agricultural policy versus investment policy versus all these different areas of trade. And when you have large, complex negotiations and you splice up problems into various different committees, that can be useful in that it can make the tasks more manageable. It can allow for you to send people in who have expertise and knowledge in that particular area, but you might also be sending people in who don't care about that area at all. They were assigned randomly, or they care a lot about that area. It's like their pet thing, and they have something very specific that they want to see out of that um, committee's work. And so you may be putting people in who maybe don't represent the broader perspective of what others are thinking or feeling, but have self-selected into that process because of an interest, or vice versa. They might not have any interest at all in that particular policy area, and maybe aren't advocating as aggressively for their interests as they might otherwise do. It's worth pointing out that committee members have a disproportionate amount of power over that small area, right? That if you are on a committee and there's 15 of you and you're working on this thing, collectively you have a lot more control over that than everybody else has over that one area, um, which is great, except that can dramatically limit the opportunities for the kind of integrative solutions that negotiation theory tells us are really valuable and important to getting successful negotiations, right? So part of successful negotiations, part of creating value, means that we find different issues that we can tie together, things that maybe we can both benefit from, or I can give you a concession that is pretty small for me but means a lot for you. If you've sliced your topic up in all these different subtopics and committees might not be able to ask other committees to make concessions to get progress in one particular area. And so you can lose those opportunities to create um, value for all parties involved. Now, it's possible that the committee work will then be looked at by the whole, right? And everybody will sort of look at everything and say, oh, well, this committee did this work, but it would be nice if we could trade something done in this committee for something done in that committee over there. That's possible. Sometimes the rules of negotiation allow for that. Or sometimes it's just whatever the committees produce gets smashed together, and we call that the agreement. Depending upon how committees work, you may miss out on a lot of opportunities to create that kind of value through trading across issues. And then finally, I'd like to flag two, I guess, fairly prominent negotiation processes that played out in somewhat unusual ways, maybe not radically unusual, but I think are worth thinking about as different models for what negotiation might look like. So the Dayton Accords that ended the civil war in Bosnia involved a process of shuttle diplomacy involving Richard Holbrooke, where Richard Holbrooke was essentially hopping from one capital to another all across the southeastern Europe, trying to get leaders who just wouldn't talk with each other. They just politically couldn't sit down and talk. They either hated each other, they didn't want to be directly involved, maybe they were, strategically keeping a distance, or they didn't want to be seen selling out or betraying or aligning with other leaders and factions. And so Holbrook is just hopping around to different folks, listening to what they have to say, listening to their perspective, articulating the US's perspective, sharing what others have said. And as he hops from one capital to another, meeting with leaders, he's building an agreement of what everyone can more or less work on. And so when they finally come together to negotiate a final agreement at Dayton, there's sort of a basic framework that says this is what this is going to look like and how we're going to move forward. And he was able to build that amongst people who wouldn't talk to each other through this process of shuttle diplomacy, of going from one capital to another, passing the word, and maybe massaging some of the rough edges out of the language and out of the interactions. Another peace process that sort of played out in a unique way was the Oslo Accords. This was the agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization that creates the Palestinian Authority and lays the foundation for, in theory, a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And it came at a time when essentially things were deadlocked between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It seemed like there was no place to move forward in terms of negotiations between the two actors. And so rather than sitting down and negotiating and having that face-to-face meeting, quietly, the leadership of Israel and the leadership of the Palestinian Liberation Organization sent representatives. And representatives is maybe even the wrong word. They weren't acting in any sort of official capacity. They were just people who were respected, thoughtful, had the ear of the political leadership, and they were sent to Oslo to hang out and drink hot chocolate with each other and talk and figure out what life was like for each other and to learn about their concerns and to talk about what a future might look like. And out of that dialogue that took place over an extended period of time between these non-official people, there grew the kernels of a plan for how Israel and Palestine could move forward and what that might look like and how that might work. And so they were able to go back to their respective sides and make the case that no, there is a way forward, but we didn't see it and we didn't believe it was there, but we've been able to identify what that is through these informal discussions, this second track of diplomacy, the second track of conversations. We've been able to find something that we think will work. And so that's sort of a very famous sort of idea that if you get the official people in the room, they're going to be fighting for their interests. But if you get people who are maybe a step removed from the process, sitting down and maybe chatting and brainstorming, they can drill down to what are the real underlying issues and find creative solutions to resolve that. There's a third track that sometimes gets talked about. It sometimes is also described as public diplomacy, where you have people from countries just meeting, not in any official capacity, just engaging in, music concerts or university exchanges or partnerships where we build relationships with people. And the idea is that if you build relationships with people, you'll create a greater sense of goodwill and understanding, and you'll create a foundation for larger cooperation down the road. That's much less direct in terms of negotiations than two-track diplomacy, but it's also part of the context of how all these things play out.